Settle in. Let the weight of the day fall away. Tonight we are going to travel across centuries and continents, following the rise and fall of the largest empire the world has ever known. At its height, the British Empire covered more than 13 million square miles of the Earth's surface and governed more than 400 million people, roughly a quarter of humanity. It touched every ocean, every continent except Antarctica, and every major civilization of the modern world. Its consequences, for good and for ill, are still being sorted out today. This is not a simple story. Empires never are. The British Empire built railways across India and extracted Indian wealth to enrich London. It abolished the transatlantic slave trade and had spent centuries profiting from it. It spread the English language and English law to places that would eventually use both to argue for their independence. It produced explorers of genuine courage and administrators of genuine dedication, alongside slavers, looters, and architects of deliberate famine. To tell its story honestly requires holding all of these things at once, without collapsing into either simple celebration or simple condemnation. We will move through this story slowly, as the night deserves. We will begin before the empire was an empire, when England was a small island kingdom on the edge of Europe, and we will follow the thread of expansion all the way to the 20th century, when the flags came down and the world Britain had made was left to find its own way forward. The night is long, the story is long, let us begin. Chapter 1: An Island on the Edge of the World. England in the 15th century was a kingdom of perhaps 2.5 million people, battered by a century of plague, convulsed by the Wars of the Roses, and acutely aware of its own peripheral position in European affairs. The great powers of the age were the Italian city-states, the Iberian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, the Ottoman Empire pressing at the gates of Eastern Europe, and the Holy Roman Empire sprawling across the German lands. England was a minor player, exporting wool and cloth, fighting intermittent wars with Scotland and France, and looking across the Channel at a continent considerably more sophisticated and considerably more powerful than itself. And yet England had advantages that were not immediately obvious. It was an island, which meant it was difficult to invade, and did not need to maintain the enormous standing armies that exhausted the treasuries of continental powers. It had a tradition of common law and parliamentary government that, however imperfect, distributed power more broadly than most European monarchies and created a relatively stable framework for commerce. It had long coastlines and a seafaring tradition rooted in the North Sea fishing grounds and the cross-channel wool trade, and it had something harder to quantify, a restless energy that would eventually express itself in the most dramatic territorial expansion in human history. The story of the British Empire properly begins not in England but in Portugal and Spain, whose voyages of discovery in the late 15th century opened the oceanic world to European exploitation and set the terms within which all subsequent imperial competition would take place. It was Portuguese navigators, working their way down the west coast of Africa under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, who developed the techniques of deep-sea sailing, the instruments of celestial navigation, and the logistical systems for long-distance oceanic voyages that would make the age of exploration possible. It was a Portuguese fleet that rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and reached the Indian Ocean. It was a Portuguese expedition that reached India in 1498, establishing the sea route to the spice trade that would transform the global economy. And it was a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing under Spanish sponsorship, who crossed the Atlantic in 1492 and stumbled on the Americas, opening an entirely new hemisphere to European ambition. England was watching all of this from the sidelines, and England was not pleased. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus, the English King Henry VII sponsored a voyage by another Genoese mariner, Giovanni Caboto, known in English as John Cabot. Cabot sailed westward from Bristol and reached the coast of North America, probably Newfoundland or Labrador, becoming the first European since the Norse to touch the mainland of the continent. He planted a flag, claimed the land for England, and returned to report to his patron. Henry VII gave him £10 and a pension. The claim lay dormant for nearly a century. That century was not wasted. English merchants and mariners were learning their trade, building their ships, developing their commercial networks, and accumulating the capital and knowledge that would eventually fund expansion. The English cloth trade was the engine of this commercial development, linking English wool producers to Flemish and Italian weavers, and creating a class of merchant entrepreneurs comfortable with risk and accustomed to operating across national boundaries. The Reformation, which began in Germany in 1517 and reached England in the 1530s when Henry VII broke with Rome, transformed the religious landscape of Europe and added a new dimension to imperial ambition. Protestant England found itself in explicit competition with Catholic Spain and Portugal, and this religious rivalry gave English expansionism an ideological charge it had previously lacked. Raiding Spanish treasure fleets became not merely profitable but righteous. Establishing Protestant colonies in the Americas became not merely commercially advantageous, but a blow for God against the Antichrist in Rome. The Elizabethan era, the reign of Queen Elizabeth I from 1558 to 1603, was the period in which English maritime ambition fully awakened. The Queen's long reign provided political stability, and her encouragement of maritime enterprise, however unofficial, provided cover and occasional financial support for a generation of sea captains who were exploring, trading, and raiding in every ocean. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, the second man in history to do so, returning with a ship so laden with Spanish treasure that his investors received a return of 4,700%. Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his ship. The message was unmistakable. The Queen approved. Walter Raleigh attempted to plant the first English colony in the Americas at Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, in 1585 and again in 1587. Both attempts failed. The second colony, the famous Lost Colony, simply vanished from the historical record, its fate unknown to this day. But the failure did not extinguish the ambition. It simply deferred it. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was the event that most clearly opened the door to English expansion. The Armada was a Spanish attempt to invade England, depose the Protestant Queen, and restore Catholic rule. Its failure, in a combination of English naval skill, Dutch assistance, and catastrophic storms, removed the most serious threat to English security and established that England could defend itself against the greatest naval power in the world. More importantly, it began the slow erosion of Spanish maritime supremacy that would, over the following century, open the oceans to English competition. Chapter 2: The First Settlements. The 17th century was the century of English settlement, the period in which the tentative maritime explorations of the Elizabethan era were consolidated into permanent colonies. It was a messy, violent, frequently disastrous process driven by a mixture of commercial calculation, religious conviction, desperation, and sheer stubbornness. The Virginia Company, chartered by King James I in 1606, was the vehicle for the first successful English settlement in North America. Its investors were London merchants who believed, on the basis of very limited evidence, that Virginia was rich in gold and silver, and that the native peoples would welcome English settlers as trading partners. They were wrong on both counts. The colonists who arrived at Jamestown in May 1607 found a disease-ridden tidal estuary, hostile indigenous people who had every reason to distrust European intentions, and no gold. They suffered catastrophically. By the end of the first winter, only 38 of the original 104 settlers were alive. Subsequent supply ships brought more colonists, and subsequent winters killed more of them. The colony survived by a combination of luck, indigenous assistance, and the iron-willed governance of figures like John Smith, who famously enforced the rule that those who would not work would not eat. Survival eventually came through tobacco. John Rolfe, who would later marry the Powhatan chief's daughter Pocahontas, developed a hybrid tobacco plant suited to the Virginia climate, and by 1614, the colony was exporting tobacco to England in quantities that finally made the investment worthwhile. The Virginia colony became profitable, and profitability meant survival. Over the following decades, the English colony on the Chesapeake expanded rapidly, and its expansion came at the direct expense of the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy, whose lands were taken, whose people were killed or driven away, and whose leader Opchancanoughf launched two major uprisings in 1622 and 1644 that killed hundreds of settlers but ultimately could not reverse the tide of English occupation. Further north, a very different kind of colony was being planted. The Pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower in 1620 were religious separatists fleeing persecution in England, seeking not gold but freedom of worship in a new land. They established Plymouth Colony in what is now Massachusetts, and they too suffered catastrophic mortality in their first winter, surviving largely because of assistance from the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Squanto who had learned English during a period of captivity in Europe and acted as interpreter and guide. The Great Puritan Migration of the 1630s brought tens of thousands of English religious dissenters to Massachusetts, establishing a network of towns organized around Calvinist religious principles, intense communal solidarity, and a conviction that they were building a city on a hill, a model community for the watching world. These colonies were not governed primarily for commercial profit. They were experiments in godly living. But they were also communities of European settlers expanding into indigenous territory, and the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 and King Philip's War of 1675 to 1676 saw the same pattern of colonial expansion and indigenous resistance that was playing out in Virginia, only with a particularly brutal conclusion: the near-total destruction of the indigenous peoples of southern New England. The English Caribbean was developing simultaneously and would prove, for a long time, considerably more profitable than the North American colonies. Barbados was settled in 1627, and the discovery that it was ideally suited to sugar production transformed the island's economy and its social structure. Sugar was the most profitable commodity in the Atlantic world, but it required enormous labor to cultivate and process. The solution the English planters arrived at, following the example of the Portuguese in Brazil and the Spanish in their Caribbean possessions, was enslaved African labor. The transatlantic slave trade, one of the most catastrophic enterprises in human history, became central to the English colonial economy within a generation of the establishment of Caribbean sugar colonies. Between the early 17th century and the abolition of the trade in 1807, English and British ships transported approximately 3.5 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, roughly a third of the total transatlantic trade. These people were taken from their homes, families, and communities in West and Central Africa, subjected to the horrors of the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, and sold into a form of chattel slavery so brutal that life expectancy on the sugar plantations of Barbados and Jamaica was measured in years rather than decades. The profits of this trade flowed back to England, enriching the merchant families of Bristol, Liverpool, and London, financing banks and insurance companies, and providing capital for the industrial investments that would eventually produce the Industrial Revolution. The connection between the wealth of the slave trade and the wealth of industrial England is a matter of ongoing historical debate, but the basic fact of the connection is not seriously disputed. While the Americas were being settled, England was also establishing its first foothold in the trade that would eventually become its most lucrative imperial possession. The East India Company, chartered by Queen Elizabeth in 1600, was established to compete with the Dutch and Portuguese in the spice trade of the Indian Ocean. Its early decades were marked by constant competition with the Dutch East India Company, which was better funded and more ruthlessly efficient. The English were largely pushed out of the Spice Islands of the Indonesian archipelago after the Ambona Massacre of 1623, in which Dutch officials tortured and executed English merchants. Forced out of the spice trade proper, the East India Company turned its attention to the Indian subcontinent, where it established trading posts, called factories, at Surat in 1613, Madras in 1639, Bombay in 1668, and Calcutta in 1690. These posts were initially modest operations, doing business on terms permitted by the Mughal Empire and local Indian rulers, paying customs duties and operating within the framework of Indian commercial law. The company was a guest in India, at this stage, not a master. The period of the English Civil War, the Commonwealth, and the Restoration, roughly 1640 to 1660, interrupted but did not halt colonial development. Oliver Cromwell's protectorate actively pursued colonial expansion, capturing Jamaica from Spain in 1655 and promulgating the Navigation Acts, which required that trade with English colonies be carried in English ships, creating the framework of mercantile economic policy that would govern the colonial system for more than a century. Chapter 3: The Making of Trade Empire. By the end of the 17th century, England had assembled the components of what historians call the First British Empire, a network of trading posts and plantation colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean, a developing commercial presence in the Indian Ocean, and the naval power to protect these interests against European rivals. What it had not yet acquired was the territory, the institutional complexity, or the self-conscious sense of imperial mission that would characterize the Second British Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries. The Union of England and Scotland in 1707 created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and gave the entity that would become the British Empire its proper name. Scotland brought to the Union a highly educated population, a tradition of commercial enterprise, and an urgent need for access to colonial markets that the Navigation Acts had previously denied it. Scottish merchants and administrators would play a remarkably prominent role in the subsequent expansion of British power, disproportionate to Scotland's population, particularly in India and the Caribbean. The 18th century was the great age of European imperial competition, in which the major powers of the continent fought a series of global wars, whose theaters stretched from the forests of North America to the plains of India to the coast of West Africa. Britain emerged from this competition as the dominant power, not without setbacks, and the story of how it did so is in large part the story of its naval and financial capabilities. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, established Britain as a major player in European power politics and gave it Gibraltar, the strategic key to the Mediterranean and Minorca. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, saw British and French forces clashing in India and North America as well as Europe. But the decisive contest was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which Winston Churchill would later call the First World War, because it was fought simultaneously on 5 continents. The 7 Years' War was Britain's imperial breakthrough. In North America, General James Wolfe's capture of Quebec in 1759 effectively ended French power in Canada. In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 established the East India Company as the dominant power in Bengal, the richest province of the Mughal Empire. In West Africa, British forces seized French trading posts. In the Caribbean, British forces captured the French Sugar Islands. When the Peace of Paris was signed in 1763, Britain emerged as the dominant imperial power outside of continental Europe, having stripped France of Canada, most of its Indian influence, and several of its Caribbean possessions. The Battle of Plassey deserves particular attention because it was the pivot on which the entire future of India turned. Robert Clive, a young clerk turned soldier in the East India Company's service, led a force of approximately 3,000 men, two-thirds of them Indian sepoys, against the army of the Nawab of Bengal, Suraj-ud-Dawla, whose forces numbered perhaps 50,000. The victory was achieved largely through treachery. Clive had made secret arrangements with Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief, who kept much of his force out of the battle in exchange for the promise of being made Nawab himself. The military engagement itself lasted only a few hours. The consequences were immense. The East India Company gained control of Bengal's revenues, an income so vast that it transformed the company from a trading enterprise into a territorial power. Bengal's tax income was used to buy Indian goods, which were then sold in Britain at enormous profit, without any actual investment of British capital. This system, which contemporaries called the drain of wealth, and which later Indian nationalist economists would analyze in detail, transferred enormous resources from one of the world's richest regions to a small island off the northwest coast of Europe. Clive himself became fabulously wealthy. He returned to England with a fortune estimated at several £100,000, roughly equivalent to tens of millions in modern terms, and when Parliament investigated his conduct, he famously told his questioners that he was astonished at his own moderation. He was nevertheless censured, and he died by suicide in 1774, the first in a long line of company servants broken by the contradictions of the imperial enterprise. The Bengal famine of 1770 was the first great catastrophe of British rule in India. It killed perhaps 10 million people, roughly a third of Bengal's population, and it occurred in the context of company policies that continued to extract tax revenue from a countryside devastated by crop failure. The famine did not go unnoticed in Britain. Edmund Burke, the great political philosopher, made the sufferings of India under company rule a central theme of his political career, and led the failed impeachment of Warren Hastings, the company's first governor-general, in a prosecution that lasted 7 years. Burke's speeches on India are among the most powerful in the English language, and his argument that power over distant peoples entails moral responsibility toward them is one of the founding texts of the theory of trusteeship that would later be used to justify, and then eventually to dismantle the empire. In North America, the aftermath of the 7 Years' War produced a political crisis that would culminate in catastrophe for British imperial ambitions. The war had been expensive, and the British government decided, with considerable logic but catastrophic political judgment, that the American colonists should pay some of the cost of their own defense. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, and the Tea Act of 1773 produced escalating colonial resistance, culminating in the Boston Tea Party, the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. The American Revolution was a profound shock to British imperial confidence. The most prosperous, most populous, and in many ways most culturally developed of Britain's colonial possessions had rejected British sovereignty and fought a successful war to establish its independence. The defeat at Yorktown in 1781, sealed by French naval intervention, ended the war and forced Britain to recognize American independence in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. The loss of the American colonies is often described as the end of the First British Empire and the beginning of the Second. The description is somewhat schematic, but captures something real. The American Revolution forced a reassessment of colonial policy, of the relationship between metropolis and colony, and of the nature of the imperial enterprise. It also, paradoxically, accelerated British expansion elsewhere, particularly in Asia and eventually in Australia, as Britain sought to replace the losses of one empire with the gains of another. Chapter 4: The Empire in the Age of Revolution. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were shaped by two revolutions that both threatened and ultimately strengthened British imperial power: the American Revolution, which we have already considered, and the French Revolution, which began in 1789 and unleashed 25 years of warfare that would remake the map of the world. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars that followed were, among other things, the greatest imperial contest in history. Britain and France, the two leading imperial powers of the 18th century, fought for global dominance across every ocean and on every continent. When the final peace came in 1815, Britain had won decisively, and its imperial position was stronger than it had ever been. The wars produced a series of territorial acquisitions that enormously expanded the geographic reach of British power. Cape Colony at the southern tip of Africa, Ceylon, Malta, Trinidad, Tobago, St. Lucia, Mauritius, and portions of Guyana all came under British control during the Napoleonic period, either captured from France or from France's allied and client states. These acquisitions gave Britain control of key strategic points on the major oceanic trade routes, a network of coaling stations and naval bases that would support British maritime dominance for a century. The wars also produced a transformation in the nature of British power in India. The East India Company, under a succession of aggressive governor-generals, used the wars as cover and pretext for a sustained campaign of conquest that brought most of the Indian subcontinent under British control within 2 decades. Richard Wellesley, who served as Governor-General from 1798 to 1805, was the primary architect of this expansion, conducting campaigns against Tipu Sultan of Mysore, whose kingdom fell in 1799, and against the Maratha Confederacy, the most powerful remaining indigenous power in India. Wellesley's brother, the future Duke of Wellington, distinguished himself in the Indian campaigns and learned the military methods he would later deploy against Napoleon. The doctrine of the subsidiary alliance, which Wellesley used to bring Indian princes under British control, was an instrument of imperial expansion of great ingenuity. Under a subsidiary alliance, an Indian ruler agreed to maintain a British military force at his own expense, to exclude all other European influence from his territory, and to conduct his foreign policy through the company. In exchange, the company guaranteed his internal sovereignty. In practice, subsidiary alliances created dependencies. The cost of the British force typically exceeded what the Indian state could comfortably pay, leading to debt, which led to further British intervention, which led eventually to annexation. The system was a debt trap masquerading as a security guarantee. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833 were among the most significant moral achievements in British imperial history, and they deserve to be understood in their full complexity. The abolitionist movement, led by William Wilberforce, Olaudah Equiano, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and many others, was a genuine popular mobilization of extraordinary persistence and effectiveness. It is one of the earliest examples of a successful human rights campaign, and its methods, the petition drives, the consumer boycotts, the public speaking tour, the use of testimony from enslaved people themselves, prefigured the techniques of later social movements. But abolition also coincided with Britain's imperial interests in ways that complicate a purely moral reading. By 1807, the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean were in relative economic decline compared to the rising importance of India and the new settler colonies of Australia and South Africa. Britain could afford to abolish the trade in part because it was becoming less central to British prosperity. Moreover, the Royal Navy's enforcement of the abolition on the high seas, through the West Africa Squadron which intercepted slave ships from all nations, gave Britain a humanitarian justification for maintaining a naval presence that served its strategic interests. The compensation paid upon emancipation in 1833 is also worth noting. £20 million was paid to slaveholders as compensation for the loss of their human property. Not a penny was paid to the enslaved people themselves, and the freed people of the Caribbean were required to continue working for their former enslavers for a period as apprentices, a transitional arrangement that was in practice a continuation of compelled labor. Australia entered British imperial history in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet, carrying 788 convicts and their guards to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay, later moved to Port Jackson, the site of modern Sydney. The decision to use Australia as a transportation destination for convicts was made partly because the American Revolution had closed the North American outlet that had previously served this purpose, and partly because the continent seemed sufficiently distant to serve as an effective deterrent. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, who had inhabited the continent for at least 65,000 years and had developed extraordinarily sophisticated relationships with their environment, were not consulted about this arrangement. The British declared Australia terra nullius, land belonging to no one, ignoring the elaborate territorial and spiritual connections that Aboriginal peoples maintained to specific places. The diseases brought by the first settlers devastated Aboriginal communities across the continent. Violence, dispossession of land, destruction of food sources, and deliberate policy all contributed to a catastrophic decline in Aboriginal populations over the following century. The settlement of Australia expanded rapidly from the initial penal colony. Free settlers arrived in increasing numbers, attracted by land grants and the wool trade. The colony of New South Wales was established, followed by Van Diemen's Land, South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, and Western Australia. The gold rushes of the 1850s in Victoria and New South Wales brought hundreds of thousands of migrants from Britain, Europe, China, and the Americas, transforming the colonies from peripheral outposts into dynamic societies. Chapter 5. The High Victorian Empire. Victoria came to the throne in 1837, 18 years old, and reigned for 63 years, until her death in 1901. Her reign coincided with the period of Britain's greatest global power, the years in which British industrial production dominated the world economy. The Royal Navy policed the oceans, and the phrase British Empire came to mean something so large and so various that the people who administered it often struggled to comprehend its own extent. The Victorian Empire was built on the foundations of the Industrial Revolution, which had transformed Britain from an agricultural society into the world's first industrial economy in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The factories of the English Midlands and the North produced cotton cloth, iron and steel, steam engines, and an endless variety of manufactured goods at prices no pre-industrial economy could match. These goods needed markets, and the empire provided them, both as captive markets for British manufacturers and as sources of the raw materials that British factories needed. The relationship between industrialization and empire was not simply one of cause and effect. It was mutual and reinforcing. The capital accumulated through trade, including the slave trade, helped finance industrial investment. The technologies developed in industry, particularly steam power, gave Britain military and logistical advantages that facilitated further imperial expansion. The telegraph, which allowed communication across continents in minutes rather than months, gave British administrators an unprecedented ability to coordinate imperial policy. The steamship, which could move against winds and currents, made oceanic travel faster and more reliable. The railway, which the British built across India, Australia, and eventually Africa, opened interior territories to commercial exploitation and military control. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, known in British accounts as the Indian Mutiny and in Indian nationalist historiography as the First War of Independence, was the most serious challenge to British power in Asia in the 19th century. It began as a mutiny among Indian soldiers, sepoys, in the Bengal Army of the East India Company, triggered by a combination of specific grievances, most famously the introduction of rifle cartridges greased with animal fat offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, and deeper resentments about British cultural arrogance, land policies, and interference with Indian religious practices. The rebellion spread beyond the army to involve princes, landowners, and peasants across a wide swath of northern India. The cities of Delhi, Lucknow, and Kanpur became the sites of prolonged sieges and brutal fighting. Atrocities were committed on both sides. The massacre of British women and children at Kanpur became one of the founding myths of Victorian imperialism, used to justify retaliatory violence of extraordinary savagery. Villages were burned, prisoners were blown from cannons, and reprisals killed far more Indians than had died in the initial uprising. The rebellion was suppressed by 1858, but its consequences were transformative. The East India Company, which had governed India for 2.5 centuries, was dissolved. The British Crown assumed direct sovereignty over India, and in 1877, Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. A new administrative system, the Indian Civil Service, recruited through competitive examination largely from the graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, took over the governance of the subcontinent. A new policy of non-interference with Indian religious and social practices was announced, a direct response to the perceived overreach that had contributed to the rebellion. The rebellion also produced a hardening of racial attitudes among the British ruling class. Before 1857, there had been a significant current of opinion among British administrators and intellectuals that Indian society could be reformed, and that educated Indians could eventually be admitted to partnership in governing their own country. After 1857, racial thinking became more explicit and more rigid. Indians were increasingly categorized not as pupils in a school of civilization, but as fundamentally different, permanently subject, incapable of self-governance. This shift in ideology would shape British policy in India for the remainder of the imperial period. The Scramble for Africa is the name given to the extraordinary episode between roughly 1880 and 1914, in which the European powers divided the African continent among themselves with breathtaking speed and disregard for existing African political structures, cultures, and peoples. At the beginning of this period, Europeans controlled perhaps 10% of Africa. By 1914, they controlled all of it except Ethiopia and Liberia. Britain was the most successful participant in this scramble, acquiring territories that stretched from Egypt in the north to the Cape in the south, realizing a long-cherished ambition of a continuous band of British territory running the length of the African continent. The dream of Cecil Rhodes made partially real by the diplomacy of Lord Salisbury and the military campaigns of Kitchener, Lugard, and a generation of soldier administrators. Egypt came under British control through a combination of financial manipulation and military force. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869 and of crucial strategic importance for Britain's communications with India, had been financed partly by Egyptian debt. When the Egyptian government's finances collapsed, Britain bought the Egyptian shares in the canal, and when nationalist unrest threatened European interests, Britain invaded in 1882 and established an occupation that would last, in various forms, until the 1950s. Egypt was never formally a British colony. It remained nominally part of the Ottoman Empire and later an independent kingdom, but British influence over its foreign policy, finances, and military was pervasive. Sudan was brought under British-Egyptian control following a prolonged and brutal series of campaigns against the Mahdist state, an Islamic theocracy that had conquered most of Sudan in the 1880s. The climax was the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, where Kitchener's forces, equipped with machine guns and artillery, destroyed the modest army with catastrophic casualties on the Sudanese side. A young cavalry officer named Winston Churchill was present and wrote a vivid account of the battle that combined admiration for the courage of the Sudanese warriors with disturbing celebration of the slaughter. South Africa presented a different and more complicated picture. The British had acquired Cape Colony from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, inheriting a settler population of Dutch-speaking farmers, the Boers, who had their own fierce traditions of independence and their own brutal relationships with the African and mixed-race peoples of the region. British policy in the Cape, including the abolition of slavery in 1833, provoked the Great Trek of the 1830s, in which thousands of Boer families moved north and east to escape British authority, establishing the independent republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in 1867 and gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 transformed the political economics of southern Africa. The Transvaal, previously a poor agricultural republic, suddenly sat on the greatest gold deposits in the world. British capital flooded in. British entrepreneurs led by Cecil Rhodes built mining empires, and the British government began to see the Boer republics as obstacles to the consolidation of British power in the region. The Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, the largest military operation Britain had mounted since the Crimean War, was a conflict of extraordinary bitterness. The Boers were outnumbered and outgunned, but adapted to guerrilla warfare, conducting a prolonged campaign that tied down nearly 500,000 British soldiers. The British response included the burning of Boer farms and the establishment of concentration camps in which Boer women and children, and also black Africans, were imprisoned in appalling conditions. More than 26,000 Boers died in these camps, along with an estimated 14,000 to 20,000 black Africans. The revelations about the camps, publicized by the campaigner Emily Hobhouse, caused international outrage and a crisis of conscience within Britain. Britain won the war, but the peace was a negotiated settlement that gave the Boers significant concessions, including an amnesty, eventual self-government, and the exclusion of black South Africans from the political settlement. The latter concession had profound consequences. The Constitution of the Union of South Africa, formed in 1910, disenfranchised the black majority, laying the foundations for the apartheid system that would endure until the 1990s. Chapter 6: The Empire and Its Peoples. An empire that spanned the globe necessarily encompassed an almost incomprehensible diversity of peoples, cultures, languages, and historical experiences. To speak of the experience of the British Empire is to speak of something that was radically different depending on who you were, where you lived, and when. For the white settler populations of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, the empire was primarily a framework of identity, commerce, and security. These dominions, as they were called from the late 19th century onward, governed themselves in domestic affairs from the middle of the 19th century, their parliaments controlling taxation, legislation, and social policy. They were British in culture, law, and sentiment, but they were not subjects in the way that Indians or Africans were subjects. They were junior partners in an imperial enterprise from which they drew genuine benefits: military protection, preferential trade terms, access to the vast British market, and the cultural prestige of association with the world's greatest power. The relationship was not without its tensions. Canadian nationalists resented British entanglement in European wars. Australian workers resented the import of cheap goods that undercut local industry. New Zealanders developed their own distinctive national identity, partly in conscious distinction from the British model. South Africans, as we have seen, fought a war against British imperialism, and then negotiated a partnership that served white settler interests at the expense of the majority population. For the peoples of India, the empire was an experience of profound ambivalence. British rule brought certain undeniable material changes: railways, telegraph lines, a uniform legal system, suppression of the practice of sati, improvements in famine relief after the catastrophes of the 1870s. These changes benefited some Indians and harmed others. The railways, for instance, connected the subcontinent as never before and created new economic opportunities, but they were built primarily to serve British commercial interests, to move goods to the ports and troops to the trouble spots, and the fares were set to maximize revenue rather than serve Indian passengers. The educated Indian middle class that emerged in the 19th century from the English-language universities established under British rule was a creation of empire, trained in English literature, philosophy, and law, and deeply influenced by the liberal and democratic values that British education conveyed. This class produced the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, which would eventually lead the independence movement. There is a profound irony in the fact that the empire trained the people who would dismantle it, giving them the conceptual tools, the organizational models, and the moral language of rights and self-determination that they turned against their colonizers. For the peoples of Africa, the experience of empire was generally more brutal and more dispossessing than anywhere else. The African continent was divided by European powers with no reference to existing ethnic, linguistic, or political boundaries, creating the artificial nation-states whose internal contradictions would generate so much conflict after independence. The land was taken, directly in areas of white settler colonization, and more subtly elsewhere through the introduction of hut taxes and other fiscal impositions that forced African men into wage labor on European farms and mines. Traditional leadership structures were co-opted, reshaped, or destroyed depending on what served colonial administration best. The rubber terror of the Congo Free State, which was technically a personal possession of the Belgian King Leopold II rather than a British colony, nevertheless happened in the context of the scramble for Africa that Britain had helped create, and British public opinion, led by the journalist E.D. Morel and the diplomat Roger Casement, was instrumental in exposing and eventually ending the atrocities. The Congo became a byword for colonial horror. Workers who failed to meet rubber quotas had their hands cut off, villages were burned, hostages were held and killed. The death toll is estimated in the millions. In Britain's own African colonies, the record was uneven. In some areas, particularly under the policy of indirect rule developed by Frederick Lugard in Nigeria, existing political structures were preserved and used as instruments of colonial administration, with traditional rulers maintaining their authority under British supervision. In others, particularly in areas of white settler farming like Kenya and Rhodesia, land alienation and labor exploitation created conditions of systematic oppression. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, a rebellion against British colonial rule, was suppressed with a brutality that the British government spent decades attempting to conceal. Detention camps, systematic torture, and collective punishment left scars that only recently have been legally acknowledged. The empire had its believers. Men and women who went to India, Africa, and elsewhere in the service of the empire were not all hypocrites or cynics. Many genuinely believed in the civilizing mission, the idea that Britain's role was to bring law, order, education, and Christian religion to peoples they regarded, through the lens of Victorian racial theory, as less developed. This belief was often condescending, frequently racist, and sometimes used to justify extraordinary cruelty. But it was also sometimes sincere, and the people who held it were capable of genuine dedication to the welfare of the populations they governed, as they understood that welfare. The missionaries who accompanied the empire were a particularly complex case. On one hand, Missionary Christianity helped destroy indigenous cultures, suppressed traditional practices, imposed Western clothing and monogamy, and a particular conception of gender roles on societies with very different arrangements. On the other hand, missionaries often championed the rights of indigenous peoples against settler violence, ran the schools that educated the leaders of independence movements, and campaigned against the worst abuses of colonial labor systems. David Livingstone, the most famous of the African missionaries, spent his life in opposition to the Arab-African slave trade, and his expeditions into the African interior, whatever their imperial consequences, were driven by a genuine conviction that African peoples deserved freedom and dignity. Chapter 7. The Empire-AT War. The British Empire was maintained by force, ultimately, and the willingness to use that force was never far beneath the surface of imperial administration. But the empire also mobilized force on a global scale in 2 world wars, drawing on the manpower and resources of every corner of its territories. And this mobilization transformed both the empire and its subject peoples in ways that accelerated the eventual dissolution of British power. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, was fought primarily in Europe, but drew in the empire to an extent that staggered contemporaries and still staggers historical imagination. More than 2 million Indians served in the British armed forces during the war. Australia and New Zealand sent more than 400,000 soldiers, suffering casualty rates that shocked their small populations. Canada raised over 600,000 troops. South Africa sent nearly 250,000. Soldiers from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from East Africa, from Malaya and other territories served in various capacities. The Gallipoli Campaign of 1915, in which Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, suffered catastrophic losses in a botched amphibious assault on the Turkish coast, became a founding myth of national identity for Australia and New Zealand, the moment at which 2 young nations came of age through shared sacrifice. The campaign was conceived in London and executed with serial incompetence by British commanders, and the bitterness it generated contributed significantly to the development of a distinctly Australian and New Zealand consciousness that was defined partly against British metropolitan authority. Indian troops fought in France, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and East Africa. They endured the same mud and gas and barbed wire as their British counterparts and died in comparable proportions. In exchange for their service, Indian political leaders had been promised significant constitutional reforms, steps towards self-government. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919 delivered some of what was promised, but they also came accompanied by the Rowlatt Act, which extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime, allowing detention without trial. The contradiction between the promise of reform and the reality of continued repression was explosive. The Amritsar massacre of April 1919 was one of the defining atrocities of British imperial rule. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire on an unarmed crowd of approximately 15,000 to 20,000 people gathered in the enclosed Jallianwala Bagh Garden to protest the Rowlatt Act and to celebrate the festival of Baisakhi. The crowd had no means of escape. The firing continued for approximately 10 minutes until the ammunition was nearly exhausted. Official British figures acknowledged almost 400 dead and over 1,000 wounded. Other estimates were significantly higher. Dyer was subsequently removed from command, but received no criminal punishment. The Hunter Commission that investigated the massacre criticized his actions, but described them as a mistake in judgment. In Britain, opinion was divided. The House of Lords passed a motion in Dyer's favor, and a public fundraising campaign collected over £20,000 for him. The divided British response to Amritsar told the Indian independence movement everything it needed to know about the limits of British liberalism when imperial authority was at stake. Mohandas Gandhi, who had returned to India from South Africa in 1915 and was developing his distinctive method of nonviolent resistance, Satyagraha, found in Amritsar the confirmation of everything he had concluded about the nature of British rule. His campaign of non-cooperation, launched in 1920, was the first truly mass political movement in Indian history, drawing in millions of people across lines of caste, religion, and region. Gandhi's genius was to translate abstract political demands into concrete acts of civil disobedience that anyone could perform, from boycotting British cloth to refusing to pay the salt tax. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, was an even more total mobilization of imperial resources. More than 2.5 million Indians served in what was the largest volunteer army in history. Australians and New Zealanders fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Canadians were central to the Allied campaign in Western Europe. Soldiers from across Africa and the Caribbean served in multiple theaters. The fall of Singapore to Japanese forces in February 1942 was arguably the single most damaging event for British imperial prestige in Asia. Singapore had been developed as the linchpin of British defense in the Pacific, a fortress that Churchill called the Gibraltar of the East. When it fell, with its garrison of 85,000 men, surrendering to a Japanese force of less than 40,000 in a campaign of 2 weeks, the myth of British military invincibility in Asia was shattered beyond repair. The peoples of Southeast Asia who had been told that British power would protect them saw those claims exposed as hollow. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people, possibly more, and it occurred in the context of wartime policies that prioritized military needs over civilian welfare, export of food from India to Britain, and a failure of administrative response that Churchill's government allowed to persist for months after the scale of the disaster became clear. Churchill's recorded remarks about the famine, which included blaming Indians for breeding like rabbits, remain among the most damning indictments of the moral contradictions at the heart of the imperial project. The war ended in 1945 with Britain on the winning side, but financially exhausted, militarily overstretched, and politically transformed by a Labour electoral victory that brought to power a government committed to welfare state reform at home and more sympathetic to colonial nationalism abroad than its conservative predecessor. The conditions for decolonization were in place. Chapter 8: The World the Empire Made. Before we come to the dissolution of the empire, it is worth pausing to consider what the empire had made. The physical, institutional, legal, and cultural landscape it had created across the globe, which would persist long after the flags came down. The empire remade the human geography of the world through mass migration on a scale unprecedented in history. Between 1815 and 1930, approximately 20 million people emigrated from Britain to the settler colonies, the United States, and other destinations, carrying the English language, English legal traditions, and English cultural forms to every continent. This migration was partly forced, in the case of convict transportation to Australia, and partly driven by desperation, in the case of the Irish fleeing the famine of the 1840s, and partly voluntary, in the case of the hundreds of thousands who responded to the lure of land and opportunity in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The empire also moved people involuntarily on a vast scale, through the slave trade, and through the system of indentured labor that replaced it after emancipation. Hundreds of thousands of Indian and Chinese workers were transported under labor contracts to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the gold mines of South Africa, the rubber estates of Malaya, and the cane fields of Fiji, creating communities of South Asian and East Asian descent scattered across the empire. These communities maintained their cultural identities while adapting to new environments, and they would play significant roles in the politics of their adopted countries through the 20th century. The English language is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the empire. It became the language of law, administration, higher education, and commerce across an enormous swath of the globe. And even after independence, most former British colonies retained English as an official language, medium of instruction, or linguistic common ground between ethnic groups whose own languages were mutually unintelligible. The dominance of English as the global language of science, technology, diplomacy, and popular culture in the 21st century is in significant part a consequence of British imperial expansion, though the American predominance of the 20th century was equally or more important in sustaining that dominance. British law left permanent marks on the legal systems of dozens of countries. The common law tradition, with its emphasis on precedent, adversarial procedure, and the rights of the individual against the state, was transplanted to the settler colonies and, in modified form, to India and parts of Africa. The constitutional models developed in the dominions, the parliamentary democracy with its combination of elected legislature and responsible executive, became templates for independence constitutions across the decolonizing world. The railways that Britain built across India, spanning over 60,000 kilometers by the time of independence, are one of the most frequently cited examples of imperial infrastructure development. They were genuinely transformative, connecting regions previously isolated from each other, enabling the movement of goods and people at unprecedented scale, and creating the physical basis for an integrated national economy. But they were built primarily to serve imperial commercial and military interests, their rates and routes determined by those interests, and the steel used in their construction was overwhelmingly imported from Britain, denying Indian industry the stimulus that domestic production would have provided. The institutions of education that the empire planted would prove, paradoxically, to be among its most subversive legacies. The universities and schools established under British rule educated the generation that would lead independence movements. Jawaharlal Nehru was educated at Harrow and Cambridge. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a barrister trained in London. Kwame Nkrumah, the first leader of independent Ghana, attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and the London School of Economics. Julius Nyerere was at Edinburgh. These leaders absorbed the language of rights, democracy, and self-determination from their British education, and used it to argue for independence from British rule, a use for which their educators had not entirely prepared them. Chapter 9. The Beginning of the End. Decolonization, the process by which the British Empire dissolved into independent nations, was the dominant political phenomenon of the third quarter of the 20th century. It happened with a speed that surprised almost everyone, including the people who were demanding independence and those who were resisting it. India was the first and most significant case. The independence movement had been building for decades, led by the Indian National Congress and latterly by the Muslim League, which under Jinnah argued for a separate Muslim state. The Second World War had accelerated the process in multiple ways. It had demonstrated the limits of British military power. It had created a mass political consciousness among the Indian population through wartime service and propaganda. And it had so exhausted Britain's financial and military resources that maintaining the Indian Empire by force was no longer a realistic option. The Labour government of Clement Attlee, elected in 1945, was committed to Indian independence in principle, and it appointed Lord Mountbatten as the last viceroy with a mandate to transfer power as quickly as possible. The negotiations between Congress, the League, and the British authorities produced the decision to partition the subcontinent into two independent states, India and Pakistan, which came into being simultaneously on the 14th and 15th of August 1947. The partition of India was accompanied by one of the worst episodes of communal violence in modern history. As the new borders were drawn and populations began to move, Hindus and Sikhs fled from Pakistan to India, and Muslims fled from India to Pakistan in a migration that involved perhaps 10 to 15 million people, accompanied by massacres, rapes, abductions, and atrocities on a scale that left hundreds of thousands dead. The border between the two new states was drawn by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never visited India, working from maps and census data in 6 weeks. The consequences of his drawing are still being lived in the tensions between India and Pakistan 75 years later. The independence of India and Pakistan signaled to the rest of the colonial world that the British Empire was dissolving, and it unleashed a wave of independence movements across Asia and Africa. Burma achieved independence in 1948, Ceylon in 1948, Malaya in 1957. In Africa, Ghana was the first to gain independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, and it was followed by an extraordinary cascade over the next decade. Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, and so on across the continent. Harold Macmillan's Wind of Change speech, delivered to the South African Parliament in February 1960, was the clearest acknowledgement by a British Conservative Prime Minister that decolonization was not a crisis to be managed but a historical force to be accommodated. The speech enraged the South African government, which was moving in the opposite direction toward the rigid racial segregation of apartheid, and it demonstrated that even the Conservative Party, the traditional defender of empire, had accepted the inevitability of independence. Not all of decolonization was peaceful. The Mau Mau emergency in Kenya, which lasted from 1952 to 1960, involved systematic British torture and detention of Kikuyu people suspected of rebel sympathies. More than 1 million people were held in a network of detention camps described by their administrators as a pipeline through which detainees were to be processed through labor and physical hardship until their resistance was broken. The documents revealing the full extent of British brutality were hidden for decades. A Foreign Office archive discovered in 2011 contained hundreds of thousands of files that the government had attempted to destroy or conceal, and their revelation led to a legal settlement with surviving victims. The Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, was fought against a communist insurgency, primarily Chinese, in the Malayan jungle. It was eventually suppressed through a combination of military force and a sophisticated counterinsurgency strategy that included resettling rural Chinese communities into new villages, cutting them off from the guerrillas, and offering development aid in exchange for cooperation. The emergency is studied in military academies as a successful counterinsurgency, but the resettlement of several 100,000 people and the suspension of civil liberties involved were not without human cost. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the event that most clearly exposed the changed nature of British power in the post-war world. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France conspired with Israel to launch a military intervention to retake it. The operation was militarily successful but politically catastrophic. The United States, which had not been consulted and did not approve, threatened economic sanctions that would have destroyed the British pound. The Soviet Union threatened military intervention. Britain was forced to halt the operation and withdraw, the most humiliating retreat in British history since the American Revolution. It made viscerally clear that Britain was no longer a power that could act independently of American approval, and it accelerated the collapse of the imperial will to maintain overseas commitments. Chapter 10: The Last Years of Empire. The final phase of British decolonization ran from roughly 1960 to 1980, with a few territories remaining under British sovereignty or administration into the 21st century. The process was shaped by a mixture of nationalist pressure from below, British political calculation from above, and the changing international environment of the Cold War, in which both the United States and the Soviet Union, for their different reasons, were hostile to European colonial empires. Africa dominated this final phase. British Africa was a diverse landscape of territories at very different stages of political development, with populations ranging from several 100,000 to tens of millions, with economies based on everything from subsistence agriculture to mining to commercial farming, and with political movements ranging from the sophisticated mass parties of West Africa to the embryonic organizations of the East African highlands. The transition to independence in the larger West African colonies, Nigeria and Ghana, was relatively orderly. These were countries with functioning administrative systems, educated elites, and well-organized independence movements. The transition was negotiated, timetabled, and accompanied by the training of local civil servants and the constitutional structures expected of Commonwealth members. East and Central Africa were more complicated because of the presence of white settler communities who were unwilling to accept African majority rule. Southern Rhodesia, with its powerful white settler community, refused the path to independence offered to other African territories and unilaterally declared independence under Ian Smith in 1965, refusing to accept the principle of majority rule. Britain declared the unilateral declaration of independence illegal, but was unwilling to use military force to reverse it. Economic sanctions were applied, but largely evaded through South Africa. The conflict in Rhodesia continued until 1980, when a settlement resulted in internationally recognized independence as Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. The independence of Zimbabwe in 1980 effectively marked the end of the British Empire in Africa. The remaining overseas territories, the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, various Caribbean islands, and a scattering of Pacific and Atlantic territories, were small in population and showed little desire for independence. The Falklands War of 1982, in which Britain sent a naval task force to retake the islands after Argentine invasion, demonstrated both that Britain retained a residual capacity for independent military action, and that its will to maintain even tiny overseas territories could be fierce when sovereignty was directly challenged. Hong Kong, the last significant British imperial possession, was returned to China in 1997 under the terms of an agreement negotiated by Margaret Thatcher's government. The handover ceremony, presided over by the Prince of Wales and the last Governor Chris Patten, was a carefully managed piece of symbolism, the lowering of the Union flag and the raising of the Chinese and Hong Kong flags in the driving rain. It marked the formal end of the British Empire as a significant territorial reality, though not of British influence in the world. The Commonwealth of Nations, the association of former British territories that replaced the Empire as the framework for British international relationships, was established in its modern form in 1949. It has no formal authority, no binding commitments, and no common policy beyond a loose adherence to shared values of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, values that member states honor with varying degrees of consistency. At its best, the Commonwealth provides a network for practical cooperation, educational exchange, and diplomatic consultation. At its worst, it is an institutional fig leaf that allows Britain to maintain the form of global influence after the substance has departed. The legacy of empire for Britain itself is contested and continues to be contested. The wealth that empire generated undeniably contributed to British prosperity and to the capital accumulation that funded the Industrial Revolution and the social investments of the 20th century. The cultural diversity that empire brought to Britain through the migration of people from the Caribbean, South Asia, West Africa, East Africa, and elsewhere has transformed British society in ways that are still being negotiated. The institutional self-confidence that empire generated, the sense of British exceptionalism and natural global leadership, has been slow to decay and arguably distorts British foreign policy and national self-understanding to this day. Chapter 11: Trade, Commerce, and the Economics of Empire. The British Empire was built on trade, sustained by trade, and ultimately judged in the minds of its architects by whether it was commercially profitable. The economics of empire were never simple, and the question of whether empire paid for Britain as a whole rather than for specific groups of merchants, investors, and administrators is one of the most debated in imperial historiography. The early modern empire operated under the doctrine of mercantilism, the belief that national wealth was determined by the accumulation of gold and silver, and that colonial trade should be organized to maximize the flow of these metals and of valuable commodities generally to the metropolis. The Navigation Acts, beginning with Cromwell's Act of 1651, required that trade with British colonies be carried in British ships, and that certain enumerated commodities, tobacco, sugar, cotton, indigo, could be sold only to British buyers. The effect was to capture the profits of colonial trade for British merchants and the British Exchequer, and to exclude competitors. This system worked, in the sense that it channeled colonial profits to Britain, but it also created resentments, particularly in the American colonies, where it restricted economic development and was experienced as exploitation. The American Revolution was in part a revolt against the mercantilist system, and after independence, the American Republic's economic success on free trade principles undermined the case for mercantilism. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in the year of American independence in 1776, argued systematically against mercantilism and for free trade as the basis of national prosperity. Smith was skeptical of colonies. He argued that they were economically costly, that the wars fought to protect them were more expensive than any trade benefits they provided, and that British consumers would be better served by free trade with the whole world than by the restricted trade of the colonial system. Smith's arguments were influential, and by the middle of the 19th century, Britain had abandoned the Navigation Acts and the system of colonial preference, adopting free trade as the governing principle of its commercial policy. The free trade empire of the mid-Victorian era was in some ways more effective than the mercantilist empire it replaced. British manufactured goods, produced at lower cost than any competitor by the Industrial Revolution, flooded global markets without needing the protection of colonial preference. British capital flowed to railways, ports, and infrastructure around the world, earning returns while developing the capacity that made those markets more profitable. The Royal Navy policed the oceans, suppressing piracy, enforcing treaties, opening recalcitrant markets. China was forced to open its ports to British trade by the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860. A particularly stark example of the use of military force to create commercial opportunity. The Opium Wars are among the most morally complex episodes in British imperial history. Britain had a serious trade deficit with China. It bought vast quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but had little to sell that Chinese consumers wanted. British merchants discovered that opium, produced in Bengal and grown largely with the coercive involvement of Indian peasant farmers, was one commodity that Chinese consumers wanted in large quantities. The Qing government, alarmed by the social and economic consequences of widespread opium addiction, attempted to suppress the trade. Britain went to war twice to prevent this suppression, winning both wars and imposing treaties that opened Chinese ports to trade, legalized opium imports, and ceded Hong Kong. The economist John Maynard Keynes, writing in the 1930s, calculated that the income Britain earned from its overseas investments, the dividends of a century of capital export, was sufficient to cover its import surplus without any need for colonial trade at all. His calculations suggested that the empire, by the early 20th century, was not economically essential to Britain's prosperity, that Britain could have sustained its living standards through the returns on its global investments alone. Whether this calculation is correct, and whether it holds for earlier periods when the empire was more clearly central to the national economy, remains debated. What is not debated is that specific groups within Britain, the cotton manufacturers of Lancashire, the tea importers of London, the railway bondholders, the shipping companies, the banking houses, benefited enormously from empire, and that these groups had the political influence to shape imperial policy in their interests. The question of whether empire was good for the average British worker, who paid taxes for imperial defense and consumed goods produced in part by colonial labor, is considerably less clear. Chapter 12: Resistance and Rebellion Across the Empire. The British Empire was never simply imposed without resistance. At every stage of its expansion and throughout its duration, the peoples it sought to govern, exploit, or displace fought back, in forms ranging from open military confrontation to quiet daily non-cooperation to organized political movements. This resistance is as much a part of the story of the empire as the conquest and administration that provoked it. The military resistance of the early colonial period has already been touched on. The Powhatan uprisings in Virginia, King Philip's War in New England, the Messenian-like cycles of defeat and rebellion that characterize so many colonial frontiers. What deserves emphasis is that, in many cases, the indigenous peoples who resisted were not fighting lost causes from the beginning. The outcomes of these conflicts were often contingent, shaped by specific military decisions, by the timing of disease outbreaks, by the choices of individual leaders, and by the complex internal politics of both the colonial and the indigenous communities. The British Empire won its wars of conquest partly through superior technology, partly through the devastating impact of epidemic disease, and partly through the ability to play one indigenous group against another. The most sustained military resistance to British expansion in Asia came from the Maratha Confederacy in India, which fought the British across 3 wars spanning decades and was only finally defeated in 1818. The Marathas were not a single ethnic group, but a confederation of Hindu warrior states that had been the dominant power in the Indian subcontinent after the decline of the Mughal Empire. Their defeat required the full resources of the East India Company and the military genius of the Duke of Wellington. And even after their defeat, Maratha military traditions continued to influence Indian military culture. In Africa, the Zulu kingdom under its great military king Shaka and his successors built a powerful military state that resisted British expansion for decades. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, provoked by British determination to incorporate the Zulu kingdom into a planned confederation of South African territories, produced one of the most dramatic British military disasters of the imperial period. At the Battle of Isandlwana, a Zulu impi, a fighting regiment, attacked and destroyed a British camp, killing over 1,300 British and Allied troops in a few hours. The shock in Britain was enormous, but the subsequent Battle of Ulundi, in which Zulu warriors attacking a British square were cut down by rifle fire and artillery, demonstrated the limits of military courage against industrial firepower. The resistance of the Pashtun peoples of the Afghan frontier, the famous northwest frontier that was one of the most persistently troublesome borders of the Indian Empire, continued throughout the period of British rule and was never fully subdued. 3 Anglo-Afghan wars in 1839 to 1842, 1878 to 1880, and 1919 demonstrated that Afghanistan could not be conquered and held, and the great game of imperial competition between Britain and Russia in Central Asia was ultimately resolved not by victory, but by mutual recognition of limits. The First Afghan War ended in one of the greatest disasters in British military history. An army of approximately 16,000 soldiers and camp followers retreated from Kabul in January 1842 through winter mountain passes in the face of Afghan attack. Of the entire force, one man, Dr. William Brydon, reached the British position at Jalalabad alive. His arrival, exhausted and wounded on a dying horse, became one of the iconic images of Victorian military history, the survivor of catastrophe arriving to report the obliteration of an army. It was also a reminder that the empire's reach could exceed its grasp. The Irish resistance to British rule deserves special attention because Ireland was the nearest and oldest colonial relationship, the one that most starkly exposed the contradictions between British liberal values and imperial practice. Ireland had been under English and then British rule in various forms since the 12th century, but the Act of Union of 1800, which abolished the Irish Parliament and integrated Ireland directly into the United Kingdom, was in practice experienced as a form of colonial incorporation. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, in which a potato blight killed the crop on which perhaps a third of the Irish population depended for subsistence, killed approximately 1 million people, and drove another million or more to emigrate in the immediate crisis years. Total Irish emigration between the 1840s and the end of the century amounted to several million, dramatically reducing the island's population. The famine occurred within the framework of British free trade ideology, which resisted the kind of government intervention that might have prevented the worst outcomes, and food continued to be exported from Ireland during the famine years, a fact that Irish nationalists would cite for generations as evidence of imperial indifference or malice. Irish nationalism, culminating in the Easter Rising of 1916 and the War of Independence of 1919 to 1921, led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, the most significant territorial loss Britain suffered in the early 20th century outside of the broad retreat from empire after the Second World War. The partition of Ireland, which left 6 counties of Ulster under British sovereignty, created a conflict that would smolder for 50 years and explode into the troubles of 1969 to 1998, the longest sustained political violence in 20th century Western Europe. Chapter 13: Women and the Empire. The history of the British Empire was for long written as a history of men: male explorers, male administrators, male soldiers, male missionaries, male merchants. The contributions of women to the imperial project and the ways in which empire shaped the lives of women both in Britain and in the colonized world were largely invisible in this traditional narrative. The recovery of women's roles in imperial history has been one of the major contributions of the past several decades of scholarship. What has emerged is a complex picture in which women were simultaneously agents of empire and its subjects, simultaneously privileged by their race and nationality, and constrained by their gender, simultaneously participants in the exploitation of colonized peoples and occasional champions of the rights of those same peoples. British women who went to the colonies as wives of administrators, missionaries, or planters occupied a peculiar social position. They were expected to maintain the standards of British domesticity in tropical climates, to create homes that reproduced the social forms of the metropolis, to socialize with other European women rather than with indigenous populations, and to embody the moral and racial superiority that justified the imperial enterprise. The rigidity of the racial and social boundaries they were expected to maintain often intensified as the imperial period progressed, reflecting anxieties about racial mixing and the stability of colonial authority. At the same time, the empire offered some British women opportunities that were not available to them at home. Florence Nightingale's work in the Crimean War, though not imperial in a strict sense, opened the way for a generation of women to enter the medical and nursing professions and to serve in imperial contexts. Women missionaries went to Africa and Asia in large numbers, often with considerably more autonomy than they would have had in Britain, running schools and hospitals and engaging directly with the populations around them in ways that their male colleagues did not always manage. Mary Kingsley, who traveled alone through West Africa in the 1890s and wrote 2 books about her experiences that were bestsellers in Britain, represents a type of the independent imperial woman who did not fit the expected mold. Kingsley was not a missionary or an administrator's wife. She was an independent traveler and ethnographer who developed a genuine respect for African cultures and was a critic of the paternalism of colonial administration and of missionary interference with African social life. Her books challenged British readers to see Africans as people with their own intelligence and dignity, at a time when such a perspective was unusual. For women in the colonized world, the empire had very different consequences. The imposition of British legal systems created situations in which women were sometimes advantaged, sometimes disadvantaged, sometimes both simultaneously. In India, the campaign against sati, the practice of widow immolation, was presented as a liberation of Indian women by British reformers, but was experienced by many Indians as an intrusion into religious practice and an assertion of cultural superiority. The campaign against child marriage, similarly, was motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of young girls, but was conducted in a manner that reinforced the colonial claim that Indian society was barbaric and required British guidance. The women of the Caribbean, the descendants of enslaved people, occupied a position in which race and gender intersected with particular complexity. Free after emancipation in 1833, they were nevertheless subject to a colonial system that valued them primarily as agricultural labor and was deeply hostile to the autonomous households and family structures that freed people were trying to create. Black Caribbean women who sought education, economic independence, or social respect confronted a colonial system organized to deny all of these to people of their color. Chapter 14. Ideas that built and broke the empire. Empires are not built by force alone. They require an ideology, a set of ideas that justify the enterprise to those who conduct it, and ideally, to those who are subjected to it. The British Empire developed an elaborate intellectual superstructure over 3 centuries, drawing on religious, scientific, philosophical, and literary traditions to explain and justify its existence. The earliest justifications for English colonialism were religious and legal. The Protestant mission to bring Christianity to heathens, developed in contrast to the Catholic model of conversion by force, provided an ideological framework for expansion. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, which held that land not occupied and cultivated in the European agricultural manner, was unowned and therefore available for settlement, provided justification for the dispossession of indigenous peoples, who used land in ways that European law did not recognize as ownership. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries produced a more secular and more complicated engagement with empire. On one hand, Enlightenment thinkers developed the concept of natural rights, the idea that all human beings possess fundamental rights that no government may legitimately deny, which was eventually used to argue for the rights of colonized peoples. On the other hand, the Enlightenment also developed the concept of stadial history, the idea that human societies pass through fixed stages of development from savagery to barbarism to civilization, which provided an apparently scientific justification for ranking different peoples on a scale of development, and for arguing that less developed peoples required the guidance of more advanced ones. The concept of civilization, as the Victorians understood it, was doing a great deal of work in imperial ideology. It combined a genuine set of values, the rule of law, individual rights, religious toleration, scientific rationality, with a deeply Eurocentric assumption that these values were the exclusive property of a particular civilization, and that non-European peoples, however noble in their primitive state, were deficient in them. This combination allowed Victorians to believe simultaneously that all human beings were capable of improvement, and that British guidance was necessary for that improvement to occur, at least for the foreseeable future. Social Darwinism, the application of Darwin's concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest to human societies, provided an even more explicit racial hierarchy in the late 19th century. Spencer, Galton, and other theorists argued that different human races were at different stages of biological as well as cultural evolution, and that the dominance of European peoples over others was a natural expression of their superior fitness. These ideas circulated widely in the later Victorian and Edwardian periods and provided intellectual cover for policies of racial discrimination and imperial exploitation. But the empire also generated its critics, from within Britain and from within the colonized world. Adam Smith, as we have noted, was skeptical of colonies from an economic perspective. Edmund Burke brought a moral critique that anticipated later humanitarian challenges to imperial practice. The abolitionist movement mobilized religious and humanitarian values against the slave trade and slavery. John Stuart Mill, himself an employee of the East India Company and a defender of empire in some respects, articulated in On Liberty a theory of individual rights that was logically incompatible with the denial of self-government to colonial peoples, and Mill's liberal successors were compelled to grapple with this contradiction. The nationalist intellectuals of the colonized world turned the empire's own ideological tools against it. Jawaharlal Nehru, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, used the language of democracy and self-determination, languages that Britain had deployed in its opposition to Nazi tyranny, to argue for Indian independence. Kwame Nkrumah used the language of Pan-Africanism, itself partly developed in the Caribbean and the United States by people of African descent who had been shaped by British imperial education, to build the independence movement in Ghana. Frantz Fanon, the Martinique-born psychiatrist who became the theorist of anti-colonial revolution, turned the empire's racial ideology inside out, arguing that colonialism had created a pathology of self-hatred among the colonized that could only be healed through the violence of liberation. His work, particularly The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, was read across the decolonizing world and became a foundational text of post-colonial thought. Edward Said's Orientalism, published in 1978, provided a systematic analysis of the ways in which Western scholarship had constructed images of the non-Western world, particularly the Middle East, that served imperial purposes. Said argued that the academic disciplines of Oriental studies, anthropology, and geography had participated in the creation and maintenance of imperial power by producing knowledge that framed non-Western peoples as exotic, inferior, irrational, and in need of Western guidance. Said's critique opened a generation of scholarly reconsideration of the relationship between knowledge and power in the imperial context, and post-colonial studies has been one of the most productive areas of humanities scholarship in the past 4 decades. Chapter 15: The Empire in Memory and the Present. The British Empire ended as a territorial reality in the second half of the 20th century, but it has not ended as a subject of public debate, historical inquiry, or political controversy. In Britain and in the former colonies, the memory of empire shapes political identities, educational curricula, architectural landscapes, and cultural self-understanding in ways that are still being negotiated. In Britain, the debate about empire has intensified in the early 21st century. Surveys consistently show that a significant proportion of the British public feels that the empire was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of, and that a majority believes it was a force for good in the world. These surveys reflect a public memory of empire shaped heavily by the nostalgic celebration of Victorian achievements, by school curricula that until recently gave little attention to the violence and exploitation that accompanied British expansion, and by a cultural tendency to associate the empire with Kipling's If, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and Gordon at Khartoum rather than with the Amritsar massacre, the Bengal famine, or the Mau Mau detention camps. The toppling of the statue of the Bristol slave trader Edward Colston in June 2020, during the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd in the United States, crystallized a public debate about the physical memorialization of empire in British cities. Statues of slave traders, colonial administrators, and imperial heroes in public spaces across Britain became contested objects, and the debate about whether to remove them or contextualize them revealed deep divisions in British society about how the imperial past should be remembered and evaluated. For the countries that were colonized, the memory of empire is also complex and contested, though often in different ways. In India, the partition and the Bengal famine loom large in historical consciousness, but so does the institutional legacy of British rule. The railways, the legal system, the English language, the parliamentary democracy. Indian historians and politicians debate whether British rule was on balance beneficial or harmful to India's development, a debate that is inevitably shaped by political positions on nationalism, economic development, and the nature of historical causality. In Africa, the arbitrary borders drawn by European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which divided the continent without reference to ethnic, linguistic, or political realities, have been a source of instability and conflict throughout the post-colonial period. The civil wars and ethnic conflicts of post-independence Africa cannot all be attributed to the colonial legacy, but the colonial legacy is unquestionably one of the factors that shapes them. The institutions created by colonial rule, the administrative structures, the judicial systems, the educational frameworks, were designed to serve colonial rather than indigenous purposes, and their adaptation to the needs of independent states was a process of considerable difficulty. The question of reparations for colonialism, including reparations for the slave trade, has become an increasingly prominent political demand in recent years. Caribbean governments have organized through the CARICOM Group to develop a formal reparations claim against Britain and other former slave-trading nations. This demand is based on the argument that the wealth accumulated through slavery and colonial exploitation provides the foundation for contemporary British prosperity, and that justice requires acknowledgement and material redress. The British government has consistently rejected the demand, arguing that responsibility for historical wrongs cannot be inherited by present generations, a position that is philosophically contested and politically sensitive. The Commonwealth, the successor institution to the Empire, continues to provide a framework for British international relationships, though its relevance and purpose are frequently questioned. Its 56 member states represent a third of the world's population and include countries at every stage of economic development, with every form of government from liberal democracy to authoritarian monarchy. The values it professes, democracy, rule of law, human rights, are honored inconsistently by its members, and Britain's own record on these values in its imperial period is a subject of some embarrassment when they are raised. Britain's sense of itself in the world continues to be shaped by the imperial past, even in its absence. The aspiration to a special relationship with the United States, the attachment to permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council, the assumption of a global role in diplomatic and military affairs disproportionate to Britain's current economic and military weight, all reflect a political culture still absorbing the transition from imperial power to medium-sized European nation-state. The decision to leave the European Union in 2016, shaped in part by a nostalgia for national sovereignty and global reach that draws on imperial memory, is perhaps the most dramatic recent expression of this difficulty in calibrating Britain's place in a post-imperial world. Chapter 16: The Architecture of Empire. The British Empire built things. Across the globe, it left a physical legacy of buildings, railways, harbors, roads, and cities that still shape the landscapes of former colonies. These physical remains are among the most visible and tangible aspects of the imperial legacy, and they raise questions that are simultaneously aesthetic, historical, and political. In India, the British built on a scale that reflected their sense of imperial grandeur and their conviction that architecture could embody authority. The great government buildings of New Delhi, designed by Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker and completed in 1931, are among the most ambitious architectural projects of the 20th century. The Viceroy's House, now the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the President's official residence, is a building of enormous size and formal dignity, synthesizing Western classical and Indian architectural traditions in a way that declared both British dominance and a certain deference to Indian cultural heritage. The achievement is remarkable. The context in which it was created as the capital of a colonial administration is troubling. The railway stations of India are another monument to imperial architecture. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus in Mumbai, built in the 1880s as the Victoria Terminus, is a Victorian Gothic fantasy in marble and basalt, part cathedral and part train station, a building that asserts the permanence and grandeur of British power in a form that is also genuinely beautiful. It is now a World Heritage Site, claimed with pride by the city that was built in large part by the labor of its residents. In Africa, the imperial cities created by British colonialism, Nairobi, Lusaka, Harare, have left landscapes sharply divided between planned European residential areas, with wide roads, large gardens, and colonial bungalows, and the African townships that were built to house the labor force at a safe distance from the European city. These spatial legacies of apartheid and segregation are not easily dismantled, and the geography of inequality in post-colonial African cities is in significant part a physical inscription of colonial racial policy. The country houses of Britain itself bear the marks of imperial wealth. The great estates built or extended in the 18th and 19th centuries by nabobs, the term of slightly derogatory admiration applied to men who had made fortunes in India, and by West India merchants and plantation owners, are physical monuments to the flow of colonial wealth into the British landscape. The National Trust, which manages many of these estates for the public benefit, began in 2020, a project of researching and acknowledging the connections between its properties and the history of slavery and empire, generating considerable public controversy, but also considerable historical illumination. The museums and galleries of Britain are also repositories of the material culture of empire. The British Museum holds the Elgin marbles from Greece, the Rosetta Stone from Egypt, the Benin bronzes from Nigeria, and countless other objects acquired through purchase, gift, theft, and conquest from societies around the world. The question of whether and how these objects should be returned to their countries of origin is one of the most actively debated in the museum world, raising issues of cultural property, historical responsibility, and the purpose of universal museums that purport to hold the heritage of all humanity. Epilogue: What the Empire Means. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the Tudor maritime ambitions of the 16th century to the constitutional negotiations of the 20th, from the slave ships of the Middle Passage to the independence ceremonies of the 1960s, from the mud of Plassey to the reign of Hong Kong in 1997. The story of the British Empire is one of the longest and most consequential stories in modern history, and we have done no more than sketch its outlines. What does it mean? That is the question that every generation must answer for itself, and the answers will keep changing as the world the empire made continues to evolve. For those who built and administered the empire, it meant the spread of civilization, the extension of law and order and commerce to peoples who lacked them, the fulfillment of a national, and in some cases, a divine mission. Many of these people were sincere. Many of them did genuine good within the framework of a system that was ultimately exploitative. The district commissioner in rural India, who spent 30 years learning the local language and trying to resolve disputes fairly, the missionary doctor who ran a hospital in West Africa for decades, the engineer who built the irrigation system that prevented famine. These people are part of the story too. For those who suffered under the empire, it meant something very different. The families separated by the slave trade, the Indian farmers whose land was taken for colonial agriculture, the Aboriginal Australians removed from country that had sustained them for millennia, the Kikuyu men tortured in Kenyan detention camps. These experiences are not erased by the railways or the legal system or the English language. They are as real, as consequential, and as morally demanding as any achievement of imperial civilization. The honest reckoning with empire that Britain is slowly, reluctantly undertaking in the early 21st century requires holding both of these truths simultaneously. Not the comfortable falsity that the empire was uniformly beneficial, a civilizing project whose costs were incidental to its achievements. Not the equally comfortable falsity that it was uniformly evil, a criminal enterprise with no redeeming features. But the uncomfortable truth that it was both, simultaneously in the same moment, in the same policy, sometimes in the same person. The British Empire reshaped the world. It created the international system of trade and law within which the modern global economy operates. It spread the English language to every corner of the earth. It established institutions of self-government that, however imperfectly, took root in many of the countries it administered. It also extracted vast wealth from those same countries, destroyed indigenous cultures and peoples, enslaved millions of human beings, and conducted itself with a systematic violence and arrogance that its liberal ideals could not domesticate. The empire is over. Its consequences are not. The world we live in, the global economy, the international institutions, the patterns of migration and inequality, the cultural forms and the political languages all bear its marks. To understand the world we have, we must understand how it came to be. And understanding how it came to be requires, among other things, understanding the British Empire, what it was, what it did, what it left behind, and what it still owes. The night is late. The story has been long. The Eurotas of this particular narrative continues to flow, and the mountains of its consequences still rise above the valley of the present. Sleep now, if you can, with the weight of this history held lightly, as history should be held. Seriously but not despairingly, honestly but not without hope. This has been the full history of the British Empire. Good night. Sources and further reading. For those who wish to explore further, the following works provide authoritative and accessible treatments of British imperial history. Niall Ferguson, Empire: How Britain Made the Modern World, a broadly positive assessment that emphasizes British contributions to global development while acknowledging costs. Caroline Elkins, Britain's Gulag: The Brutal End of Empire in Kenya, a devastating account of British colonial violence in the Mau Mau emergency, which earned its author the Pulitzer Prize and contributed to legal settlements for Kenyan victims. Amartya Sen, Poverty and Famines, which provides the economic analysis of the relationship between colonial policy and famine, and Development as Freedom, which situates the colonial legacy in the context of contemporary development. William Dalrymple, The Anarchy: The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, a vivid and scholarly account of the company's conquest of India. Andrea Levy, Small Island: A novel that explores the experience of Caribbean migrants to post-war Britain and the complex legacy of empire for both Britons and those from the former colonies. Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, the novel that placed African experience of colonialism at the center of world literature and remained one of the most widely read works of the 20th century. Salman Rushdie, Midnight's Children, which uses the independence of India as the pivot of a vast fictional reckoning with the colonial experience. Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the Guyanese historian's classic argument that European colonialism was the primary cause of African underdevelopment. C.A. Bailey, The Birth of the Modern World, which situates British Imperia